I had been looking forward to this trip for months. A week alone in a remote cabin, deep in the woods, away from everything. No cell service, no people, just me and the quiet. I needed the break. Work had been exhausting, and I hadn't felt like myself in a long time. The idea of being alone, surrounded by nothing but trees and the occasional deer, sounded perfect. The drive took longer than expected. The roads wound through dense forest, growing narrower as I got closer to the cabin. Eventually, the pavement turned to gravel, and the trees loomed taller, their shadows stretching across the road. My GPS lost signal about 30 minutes before I arrived, and I had to rely on a printed map I'd brought just in case. When I finally pulled up, the cabin looked exactly like the pictures online. A small wooden structure with a porch, a single window facing the front, and a chimney poking out from the roof. The place was old but sturdy, built for hunters or anyone looking to escape the modern world for a while. I stepped out of my truck and stretched. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. No sounds except for birds and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. I unloaded my gear, making 2 trips to get everything inside. The inside was basic but comfortable. A main room with a wood stove, a small kitchen area, and a single bedroom in the back. There was a bathroom but no running water, just an old hand pump in the kitchen sink and an outhouse about 50 yards into the trees. After getting settled, I went outside to check the area. There was a woodshed stocked with dry logs and a rusty axe leaning against it. Beyond that, nothing but trees. I walked around the cabin, familiarizing myself with the surroundings. The nearest road was miles away, and there were no signs of other cabins or people. It was exactly what I wanted, total isolation. That first night, I sat on the porch, watching the trees sway in the breeze. I hadn't realized how dark it would get without city lights. The sky was clear, the stars bright, but beyond the reach of my lantern, the woods were pitch black, a kind of darkness that made you feel like the only person left in the world. It was peaceful at first, but then I started hearing noises. At first, it was just the usual sounds. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, probably a raccoon or a deer. But then there was a sound I couldn't explain. A deep, rhythmic thumping. Not loud, but steady. I stood up, trying to pinpoint the direction. It was coming from the trees, somewhere beyond the outhouse. It stopped after a minute, and I told myself it was nothing. A branch falling, maybe. I went inside, locked the door, and got into bed. I kept a hunting knife and my flashlight on the nightstand, just in case. The night was silent except for the occasional creak of the cabin settling. Eventually, I drifted off. The next morning, I walked out to the outhouse. The ground was damp from dew, and the air was crisp. I kept an eye out for animal tracks. That's when I saw them. Not deer tracks, not bear. Footprints. Bare human footprints, leading from the trees toward the cabin, stopping just a few feet from the porch. I froze. My heart pounded. They were fresh. I had walked the same path the evening before, and they hadn't been there. Someone had been here while I was asleep. Someone had walked right up to my cabin in the middle of the night. I scanned the trees, but there was no movement, no sign of anyone, just those prints in the damp earth. I followed them back toward the tree line, but they disappeared into the undergrowth. I went back inside, locking the door behind me. I checked the windows, making sure they were latched. I hadn't seen anyone during the drive up, no signs of recent activity. Whoever had been here had to have walked in from somewhere deeper in the forest. I told myself it was probably a lost hiker. But why come so close to my cabin and then leave? Why not knock or call out? The rest of the day, I couldn't shake the unease. I carried my knife with me even just to get firewood. Every sound in the forest felt amplified, every movement in the trees suspicious. I built a fire that night, sitting on the porch with my flashlight, scanning the woods. Sometime after midnight, I heard it again. The same rhythmic thumping, closer this time. I turned off my lantern, letting my eyes adjust to the dark. The sound continued for a few minutes, then stopped. Silence. I sat there, barely breathing, waiting. Then, something moved just beyond the fire's glow. A figure, just a shape against the trees. I stood up, gripping the knife. The figure didn't move, just stood there watching. I raised my flashlight and clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, landing on empty space. No one was there. I didn't sleep that night. I sat inside with the knife in my lap, waiting for sunrise. As soon as it was light, I packed my gear, threw it in the truck, and left. The cabin had been exactly what I wanted until it wasn't. As I drove down the gravel road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Just for a second, I thought I saw movement near the cabin, a shape stepping back into the trees. I didn't stop. I didn't look back again. I just kept driving. It had been a long time since I'd had a proper break. Work had drained me, and I needed to be somewhere quiet, somewhere far from the constant buzz of notifications, meetings, and obligations. So when I found a small off-grid cabin rental deep in the woods, I jumped at the chance. The listing was simple: a one-room cabin with a wood stove, an outhouse, and no electricity. It was exactly what I was looking for. The drive up took longer than I expected. The main road turned into a gravel path, then a dirt trail riddled with potholes. My car struggled over the uneven terrain, tires slipping occasionally as I climbed higher into the hills. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already setting behind the trees, bathing everything in golden light. The cabin was smaller than I had imagined. A single wooden structure with a covered porch, the kind you'd see in old hunting magazines. A rusted axe leaned against a chopping block, and a neatly stacked pile of firewood sat beside the door. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, fresh and clean in a way I had forgotten existed. Inside, the cabin was sparse but functional. A small cot pushed against one wall, a cast iron stove in the center, a table with two mismatched chairs, and a few shelves stocked with basic cooking supplies. There were no curtains on the single window, just glass panes that reflected the encroaching darkness. A lantern sat on the table, next to a stack of old books left behind by previous guests. I set my bags down and started unpacking. I had brought enough food to last the weekend, a few extra layers for the cold nights, and my hunting knife. Not because I expected to use it, but because it felt right to have something sharp in the middle of nowhere. As night fell, the quiet settled in. It wasn't the peaceful quiet I had imagined. It was a heavy silence, pressing in from all sides. No distant hum of traffic, no murmur of voices, just the occasional creak of the trees shifting in the wind. I lit the lantern and started a fire in the stove. The warmth helped, but it didn't shake the feeling that something was off. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I just wasn't used to the isolation. I had spent too much time in the city, where solitude was rare. Here, alone in the woods, I had nothing but my own thoughts, and they were starting to get the better of me. The first night, I barely slept. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the cabin walls. At some point, I heard something outside, faint but distinct. Footsteps? No, it had to be an animal. A deer, maybe. I forced myself to ignore it and eventually drifted into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside to find a fresh set of tracks in the dirt. Not animal tracks, boots. Someone had been near the cabin. My chest tightened. I scanned the tree line, but there was nothing, just endless woods stretching in every direction. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a hunter passing through. Maybe someone checking out the old cabin, curious if anyone was staying there. But the tracks weren't leading toward the cabin. They circled it, twice. I spent the day trying to shake the unease. I hiked down to the creek, gathered firewood, and read through one of the dusty books from the shelf. But every so often, I found myself glancing toward the trees, feeling watched. That night, I barricaded the door with the table. It was probably an overreaction, but I didn't care. I kept the knife within reach and forced myself to stay awake longer than I should have. Listening. Around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow and deliberate. They stopped just outside the cabin. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tense. Then came a sound that sent a bolt of ice through my chest. The doorknob rattled. Someone was trying to get in. I gripped the knife, heart pounding. The lantern flickered, casting long shadows against the wooden walls. The door held, the rattling stopped, and then nothing. No retreating footsteps, no sound of movement, just silence. I sat there, knife in hand, until dawn. When the first light broke through the trees, I finally unblocked the door and stepped outside. There were new footprints in the dirt, leading away from the cabin. Whoever had been there had waited, standing still outside my door for who knows how long. I didn't wait to find out if they'd come back. I packed my things in record time, tossing everything into the car and speeding down the dirt road, barely stopping to avoid potholes. I didn't breathe easy until I hit pavement again. I never found out who it was or what they wanted. I didn't go to the police. What would I even tell them? That I heard footsteps in the night? That someone stood outside my door but never came in? I left a review on the cabin rental site. Short, vague, just enough to warn the next person. Felt unsafe, would not return. I got the idea to rent a remote cabin for a week, away from everything. No phone service, no distractions, just me and the wilderness. I needed the break. Work had been draining, and city life was starting to wear on me. The thought of being alone in the middle of nowhere seemed like the perfect reset. The cabin was deep in the woods, about 20 miles from the nearest small town. The rental listing had emphasized its solitude, calling it a true getaway. A dirt road wound through miles of thick forest, leading up to the property. When I pulled up, I saw the cabin was exactly what I wanted. An old log structure, simple but sturdy. There was a woodpile stacked beside the porch, a fire pit a few feet away, and a small creek running about 50 yards behind the cabin. The first couple of days were peaceful. I spent my time hiking the nearby trails, fishing in the creek, and reading on the porch. I had brought enough food and supplies to last the week, and the quiet was exactly what I'd hoped for. No honking cars, no buzzing notifications, just the wind through the trees and the occasional crack of a branch as some animal moved through the underbrush. On the third night, things started to feel different. I was sitting by the fire pit, watching the flames dance, when I noticed something out of place. A sound I hadn't heard before. It was subtle at first, just the faintest rustling in the trees behind the cabin. I brushed it off as the wind or a deer moving through the woods. But then it happened again. Closer. I turned my head toward the noise, straining to see into the tree line. My flashlight was inside the cabin, and the fire's glow only reached so far. The trees stood still. No movement, no more sound. After a few minutes, I shook off the unease and went inside, locking the door behind me. I lay in bed, listening. The woods were full of noises at night. Owls, raccoons, maybe even a coyote. But this was different. It wasn't the distant sounds of wildlife. It was deliberate, controlled. Footsteps. They circled the cabin once, then stopped. I barely slept that night, and the next morning, I walked the perimeter of the cabin, looking for tracks. The ground was mostly hard-packed dirt with patches of moss, making it difficult to tell if anything had been there. I told myself it had been an animal, maybe a bear, maybe just my imagination. That night, the sounds returned. This time, they were more distinct. Footsteps in the underbrush, stopping and starting, as if whoever or whatever it was didn't want to be heard. I sat in the dark, listening, my body tense. Then, a knock. Not loud, not forceful, just a single, deliberate knock on the cabin's front door. My heart pounded. I reached for the knife I'd brought with me, gripping it tight. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The knock didn't come again, but I could feel something, or someone, on the other side of the door. Minutes passed. Then, slowly, the footsteps moved away, back into the woods. I stayed awake the rest of the night, knife in hand. When morning finally came, I stepped onto the porch, my body stiff from tension. The forest was silent. Too silent. No birds, no insects, just stillness. I checked the area around the cabin again. This time I saw them, footprints, large, human-sized, circling the cabin before leading off into the trees. I needed to leave. The cabin had felt like a retreat, a place to be alone. Now, it felt like a trap, but I hesitated. If someone had been watching me, they might be waiting for me to let my guard down, to start hiking back to my car. And my car was nearly a mile away, parked at the end of the dirt road. I spent the next few hours locked inside, forcing myself to think logically. There was no reason anyone should be out here. No reason for them to watch me, to knock on my door in the dead of night. I had to go. Around midday, I packed my things, making sure to carry my knife in my pocket. I walked to my car as casually as I could, fighting the urge to sprint. Every step felt like an eternity. The forest pressed in on all sides, the shadows stretching longer than they should have in the afternoon sun. When I finally reached my car, I unlocked it, threw my bag inside, and started the engine in one fluid motion. Just as I was about to pull away, I saw it. A figure standing at the tree line, half hidden by the trunks. I couldn't make out any features, just the silhouette of a person. They stood perfectly still, watching me. I slammed the car into drive and tore down the dirt road, my hands shaking on the wheel. When I reached the main road, I didn't stop. I drove straight back to town and checked into a motel for the night. The next morning, I called the rental owner. I didn't mention the figure. I didn't mention the knocking. I just said I had to leave early and wanted to make sure everything was squared away. They didn't ask questions. Maybe they already knew. I never went back to that cabin. I never even looked at the listing again. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that knock on the door, and I wonder, what would have happened if I had opened it? I took the trip on a whim, needing time away from everything. A friend of a friend had mentioned an old hunting cabin up in the mountains. Secluded, quiet, completely off-grid. It was the kind of place where you could sit on the porch and hear nothing but the wind through the trees. No phone service, no distractions. Just me, the wilderness, and time to clear my head. The drive out took longer than I expected. The roads turned from asphalt to gravel, then to dirt, and finally to something that barely resembled a road at all. My truck's tires kicked up mud as I crawled over the uneven terrain. I had GPS for most of the way, but the last few miles were guesswork, following vague instructions scrawled on a piece of paper. When I finally found the place, it was nearly dusk. The cabin was old but sturdy. Weathered wood, a sagging porch, a tin roof that looked like it had seen a few rough winters. It wasn't much, but it had a solid door, thick walls, and a wood stove inside. More than enough for a few nights. I parked the truck next to the cabin and grabbed my gear. Stepping inside, the place smelled like dust and old pine. The furniture was sparse. Just a table, a couple of chairs, and a cot with a thin mattress. A small kitchen area had an ancient propane stove, a few rusting pots, and an empty icebox. There was no running water, but I'd brought plenty. I locked the door behind me and set up for the night. The silence was overwhelming. No hum of electricity, no distant traffic, just the occasional creak of the cabin settling. I lit a few candles, made a quick meal on my propane stove, and stretched out on the cot, listening to the wind outside. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. Took me a second to realize what had disturbed me. The wind had died down, but something else had replaced it. A noise just outside the cabin. At first, I thought it was an animal. A branch breaking, maybe a raccoon rummaging around. I sat up, listening. There it was again, slow, deliberate steps moving through the underbrush. I reached for my flashlight and my knife, heart pounding. The sound moved closer, then stopped. I held my breath, waiting. Silence. I stayed awake for hours, listening. Eventually, exhaustion won out and I dozed off again. The next morning, I checked around the cabin. No tracks, no signs of anything unusual. Maybe I'd imagined it. The woods could play tricks on your mind, especially when you were out here alone. I shook it off and went about my day, hiking out to a nearby stream to fill up my water bottles and get a lay of the land. By the time I got back, the sun was dipping low. I went through my evening routine, made dinner, locked up, double-checked the windows. I told myself I wasn't nervous, but I kept my knife close when I laid down that night. Sometime in the early hours, I woke again. This time, there was no mistaking it. Footsteps, right outside the cabin. Slow, heavy, purposeful. I didn't move, didn't breathe, just listened as the steps circled the cabin, pausing near the door, then moving toward the back wall. I gripped my knife so tight my knuckles ached. My truck was parked right outside, but my keys were on the table near the door. If I moved to grab them, whoever or whatever was outside would hear me. The footsteps stopped. Minutes stretched by. My ears strained, but I couldn't hear anything beyond my own heartbeat hammering in my chest. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the sounds retreated, fading into the woods. I didn't sleep after that. At first light, I grabbed my keys, my pack, and my knife and stepped outside. The ground was damp from the night air, and there, clear as day, were footprints in the mud. Boot prints. Someone had been out there, walking around my cabin, watching. I scanned the tree line but saw nothing. Whoever it was, they were gone now. I had a choice to make. Stay another night or pack up and leave. My gut told me to go, but my pride resisted. This was my trip. I wasn't going to be scared off by some drifter or a lost hunter wandering too close. Still, I spent the day uneasy, constantly looking over my shoulder. I stayed close to the cabin, keeping my knife on me at all times. That night, I barricaded the door with the table, made sure the windows were locked, and sat up late with my flashlight off, listening. And then I heard it, a scrape, something dragging along the outside wall. Then a low, deliberate knock on the door. I held my breath. My fingers tightened around my knife. Knock, knock. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. Whoever was out there knew I was inside. They were waiting. The knocking stopped. Footsteps moved along the porch. Then silence. I waited, my body frozen, for what felt like hours. Finally, as the first light crept through the trees, I dared to move. I pulled the barricade from the door, flung it open, and ran to my truck. The ground outside was covered in boot prints, circling the cabin, stopping at the windows, the door. But what sent a chill through me was the final set of prints, leading away from the porch back into the woods. A second set. Not boots, bare feet. I didn't stop to think. I started the engine, slammed the truck into gear, and tore down the trail, my tires spitting dirt. I didn't look back. I didn't slow down. I just drove mile after mile until I was back on paved roads, until I had service, until I was far, far away from that cabin. I don't know who was out there that night. I don't know what they wanted, but I wasn't going to stick around to find out. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. A week alone in a remote cabin, miles from the nearest town. No cell service, no distractions. Just me, the trees, and the quiet. The cabin belonged to a friend of a friend, and they had assured me it was well stocked and safe. It was old, but sturdy, sitting on the edge of a thick forest with a small river running nearby. The perfect place to disconnect. I arrived in the late afternoon, the gravel road leading up to the cabin barely more than 2 tire tracks cut through the trees. The place was simple, a single-story log structure with a tin roof and a wraparound porch. The inside was cozy but functional. A wood-burning stove, an old but serviceable kitchen, a small bedroom, and a bathroom with a finicky propane-powered shower. The windows were large but covered with thick curtains, and a stack of split firewood sat neatly beside the front door. After unpacking my supplies and getting a fire going, I stepped outside to take in the silence. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction, the air crisp with the scent of pine and damp earth. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and I liked that. I had always felt comfortable in the wilderness. That first night, I sat on the porch, listening to the sounds of the forest. The wind rustled the branches, and the occasional distant call of an owl echoed through the trees. I felt completely alone, but as the hours passed, an uneasy feeling settled in. Not fear exactly, but an awareness, like I wasn't as alone as I thought. I told myself it was just the unfamiliarity of the place. I had been in the woods at night plenty of times before, but something about this felt different. The trees seemed darker, the silence heavier. Every now and then, I thought I heard something, A faint rustling, the crunch of leaves, probably just a deer moving through the underbrush. Inside, I double-checked that the door was locked and secured the windows before turning in for the night. The bed was old and the mattress thin, but exhaustion from the long drive made it easy to fall asleep. I woke up in the middle of the night, disoriented. At first, I wasn't sure what had woken me. The fire had burned low, casting faint flickering shadows across the wooden walls. Then I heard it, a sound just outside the cabin. Slow, deliberate footsteps on the porch. I held my breath, every muscle tensed. The footsteps stopped, then a creaking sound, the porch boards shifting under weight. Someone was out there. I stayed completely still, listening. The wind had died down, and the forest outside was silent. No animals, no insects, just an awful, unnatural stillness. I strained my ears, trying to make out any more movement, but the only sound was my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I stayed awake for hours, barely moving, waiting for something else to happen, but nothing did. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a restless sleep. The next morning, I stepped onto the porch, scanning the area. No footprints in the dirt, no signs that anyone had been there. Maybe I had imagined it, the isolation playing tricks on my mind. I spent the day hiking around the area, trying to shake off the unease. The forest was dense but beautiful, and the river ran clear and cold. I followed it upstream for a while before returning to the cabin in the late afternoon. That night, I made sure the fire was strong before bed, the warmth comforting in the otherwise chilly cabin. I left a lantern burning low on the kitchen table, just in case. I woke up again. This time, I knew what had woken me, the sound of my front door handle turning. I bolted upright, heart slamming in my chest. The door was locked. I had checked it twice before bed, but I could hear it, slow and deliberate, someone testing it. Then, a quiet scrape, like fingernails dragging across wood. I reached for my flashlight, gripping it like a weapon. The noise stopped. I strained to hear anything else. Nothing. I stayed like that until the sun began to rise, the first light filtering through the thick curtains. Only then did I move. When I finally worked up the nerve to check outside, my stomach dropped. There, in the dirt just in front of the porch, were footprints. Bare human footprints. They led from the trees to the cabin, stopping just at the front door. But there were no tracks leading away. I searched the area, my pulse hammering. Whoever had been outside my cabin had either walked backward into the trees to hide their tracks, or they were still out there, watching. I lasted one more night. It was the same as before, waking in the dead of night to the sound of someone outside. Footsteps circling the cabin, stopping just at the windows. The door handle rattling. And then nothing. No retreat, no sound of someone leaving. I didn't wait around to find out what would happen next. At first light, I packed my things, barely stopping to eat. I threw everything into my truck and peeled out of there, the tires kicking up gravel. I never found out who or what was out there. There was no car, no signs of a camp nearby. Just those footprints, leading to my door and nowhere else. When I got back to town, I mentioned it to the friend who had lent me the cabin. They got quiet. Then they told me I wasn't the first person to leave early. Others had reported the same thing. Footsteps at night, the sense of being watched, the door handle turning on its own. No one had ever seen who or what it was. I had rented a cabin deep in the woods for a week. It wasn't a vacation, not really. I just needed to get away from everything. Work had been pushing me to my limit, and my apartment felt like a box I couldn't breathe in. I wanted space, quiet, solitude. The cabin was old but sturdy, built decades ago by a logging family. It sat a few miles off a dirt road, surrounded by thick pine and oak forests. No neighbors, no cell service. Just a single-lane road leading in and a satellite radio for emergencies. The owner, a man in his 60s, had met me at the edge of his property to hand over the key. He barely spoke, just nodded, pointed at the cabin down the road, and then drove off without waiting for small talk. That first day, I settled in. The cabin was simple. One room with a small kitchen, a wood stove, a cot, and a bathroom with questionable plumbing. A stack of firewood leaned against the side of the house. The air smelled like damp earth and pine. I liked it immediately. I spent the afternoon hiking. The forest was thick, untouched. I followed deer trails, stepping over fallen branches and wading through ankle-deep leaves. A stream cut through the trees about a mile from the cabin, cold and clear, running over smooth, dark rocks. I knelt down, cupped some water in my hands, and drank. Tasted clean, better than anything from a plastic bottle. By the time I got back, the sun had started to set. I lit the wood stove and cooked a simple meal, canned soup and bread. The fire crackled, filling the cabin with warmth. Outside, the wind picked up, whispering through the trees. I listened to it as I ate, feeling more at ease than I had in months. I went to bed early, exhausted from the hike. The cot was stiff, but the warmth of the fire made it bearable. I drifted off to sleep easily. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint orange glow across the cabin. Something had woken me, but I wasn't sure what. I lay still, listening. The wind had stopped. The forest was completely silent. Then I heard it, a single, deliberate step outside. It wasn't an animal. I knew the sound of deer moving through the woods, the quick rustle of small creatures. This was different, heavy, measured. I held my breath. Another step, then another. Slow, steady, circling the cabin. I had locked the door before bed. I was sure of it. The windows had old, wooden shutters, nothing that would keep out someone determined, but enough to hide me from view. My bag was by the door, my knife inside it. I wished I had brought something better. The footsteps stopped near the front porch. I waited. A minute passed, then two. Nothing. I let out a slow breath, trying to convince myself I had imagined it. The wind had been strong earlier. Maybe a tree branch had fallen. Maybe a deer had wandered close, its steps sounding heavier in the stillness. I told myself whatever I needed to hear to get back to sleep. The next morning I found tracks. Not animal tracks, boot prints. They circled the cabin twice, stopping at the front door. The prints were deep, made by someone heavy. I stood there for a long time, staring at them. Whoever it was hadn't knocked, hadn't tried the door, just walked in slow circles, listening, watching. I thought about packing up and leaving, but it was broad daylight, and the logical part of my brain kept telling me it was nothing. Maybe a hunter had gotten lost. Maybe it was the cabin owner checking in on the place. Maybe they'd seen the smoke from my fire and decided to leave me alone. I stayed. The second night was worse. I kept the fire going, not wanting to wake up in the dark again. I set my knife next to me, within reach. I listened. It was past midnight when I heard it. Not footsteps this time. Breathing. Close. Right outside the window. Slow, steady, deliberate. I sat up, heart pounding. The shutters were closed, but they weren't airtight. I could see a sliver of the outside through a small gap in the wood. I didn't want to look, but I had to. I leaned forward, inch by inch, until I could just barely see through the gap. First, there was nothing, just darkness, trees, the faint outline of the porch railing. Then movement, a shadow shifting, a figure standing just beyond the porch, tall, still, facing the cabin, watching. I pulled back slowly, my breath caught in my throat. The breathing outside didn't change. They knew I was awake. They were waiting for something. I didn't move for hours. I just sat there, staring at the wall, knife in my hand. The breathing stopped eventually. I never heard footsteps leaving. By dawn, I was done. I packed my things in minutes, threw on my boots, shoved my bag over my shoulder, and stepped outside into the morning light. The forest felt wrong. The trees too still, the silence too deep. I kept my knife in my hand as I walked to my truck. Then I saw it. A single boot print, pressed deep into the dirt, right outside the cabin door. Facing it, I got in my truck and left without looking back. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted. But I know one thing for sure. If I had opened that door, I wouldn't be here to tell the story. It had had been a long time since I'd taken a break. I wasn't the type to go on vacation, but after months of nonstop work, I finally took my friend up on his offer to stay at his family's remote cabin in the mountains. The way he described it made it sound perfect. A simple log cabin deep in the woods, far from cell service. A quiet escape with nothing but nature surrounding me. It was exactly what I needed. The drive up took longer than I expected. The highway turned into a two-lane road, which turned into a dirt road, which eventually narrowed to a single, winding path barely wide enough for my truck. By the time I arrived, the sun was already setting behind the dense trees. The cabin sat in a small clearing, tucked away from any main roads, completely isolated. I shut off my engine, stepped out, and took in the silence. No distant hum of traffic, no voices, no movement, just the faint rustling of leaves in the light breeze. The cabin itself was simple. Wooden walls, a pitched roof, a small porch with a rocking chair that looked like it had been there for decades. My friend had given me the key, but I barely needed it. The lock was old and loose, turning easily in my hand. Inside, the cabin smelled like pine and dust, a mix of aged wood and something faintly musty. It had been months since anyone had been here, maybe longer. There wasn't much inside. A small kitchen with an old propane stove, a table with 2 chairs, a cast iron fireplace in the corner, a single bedroom with a lumpy mattress on a wooden frame. No electricity, just a few lanterns and candles. No running water, just a well out back. It was primitive, but that was part of the appeal. I unpacked my bag, set my flashlight on the table, and lit a lantern as the last bit of daylight faded outside. I spent the first evening sitting on the porch, listening to the sounds of the forest. Crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, the distant crack of a branch as some unseen animal moved through the trees. It was peaceful, but there was something unnerving about being so far from civilization. I was completely alone. If something happened, if someone showed up uninvited, there was no one to call for help. That thought lingered in the back of my mind as I locked the door and settled in for the night. The bed was stiff, the blankets musty, but I was tired from the drive. I fell asleep quickly. I woke up in the middle of the night to a sound outside. A crunch. Footsteps. I stayed still, listening. At first, I thought maybe it was an animal, a deer, or maybe a raccoon nosing around. But the steps were deliberate, slow, moving with purpose. I reached for my flashlight, clicked it on, and aimed it at the window. Nothing. Just the empty clearing and the tree line beyond. The sound stopped. I held my breath, waiting. The silence stretched on. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it had been a branch falling, or the natural settling of the cabin. After a few minutes, I shut off the flashlight and tried to go back to sleep. I barely slept. Every little creak and groan of the cabin had me on edge. When morning finally came, I felt exhausted, but I forced myself up and went outside to look around. There, just beyond the porch, I saw them, footprints. Large, deep, unmistakably human. I felt a cold wave of fear wash over me. Someone had been here, walking around my cabin in the middle of the night. I followed the tracks a few yards before they disappeared into the woods. Whoever it was had come from the trees, walked around my cabin, and then left the same way. I told myself it was probably a hiker, someone lost or curious. But deep down, I knew that didn't make sense. This place wasn't on any trail, and no one would be wandering out here in the middle of the night without a flashlight. I spent the rest of the day trying to shake the unease. I went down to the small creek about a mile away, gathered some water, tried to focus on the peace and quiet. But the feeling of being watched never left me. That night, I locked the door, wedged a chair under the handle, and kept my flashlight within reach. I didn't sleep. Sometime past midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps. This time they were closer. Slow, deliberate, then scraping. A sound right outside the door, like metal against wood. I sat up, heart pounding. The doorknob rattled. Someone was trying to get in. I grabbed my flashlight and clicked it on, shining it toward the window. Nothing, but the doorknob twisted again. Harder this time. I jumped out of bed, grabbed the heavy iron poker from the fireplace, and stepped toward the door. My breath was coming fast, my hands sweating as I gripped the metal. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Silence. I didn't move. I stood there waiting, listening. Minutes passed, then an hour. I stayed awake until the first light of dawn crept through the window. When I finally dared to open the door, my stomach dropped. The footprints were back, circling the cabin. But this time there was something else. A knife, stuck into the wooden door, right below the handle. I grabbed my bag, threw everything inside, and left. I didn't bother cleaning up, didn't take my time. I just got in my truck and drove, the tires kicking up dust as I sped down that narrow dirt road. I never told my friend exactly what happened, just said I wasn't cut out for the solitude. But I knew the truth. Someone had been out there, watching, waiting, and if I had stayed another night, I don't think I would have made it out. It had been a long time since I'd taken a break. I wasn't the type to go on vacation, but after months of nonstop work, I finally took my friend up on his offer to stay at his family's remote cabin in the mountains. The way he described it made it sound perfect. A simple log cabin deep in the woods, far from cell service. A quiet escape with nothing but nature surrounding me. It was exactly what I needed. The drive up took longer than I expected. The highway turned into a two-lane road, which turned into a dirt road, which eventually narrowed to a single, winding path barely wide enough for my truck. By the time I arrived, the sun was already setting behind the dense trees. The cabin sat in a small clearing, tucked away from any main roads, completely isolated. I shut off my engine, stepped out, and took in the silence. No distant hum of traffic, no voices, no movement, just the faint rustling of leaves in the light breeze. The cabin itself was simple. Wooden walls, a pitched roof, a small porch with a rocking chair that looked like it had been there for decades. My friend had given me the key, but I barely needed it. The lock was old and loose, turning easily in my hand. Inside, the cabin smelled like pine and dust, a mix of aged wood and something faintly musty. It had been months since anyone had been here, maybe longer. There wasn't much inside. A small kitchen with an old propane stove, a table with 2 chairs, a cast-iron fireplace in the corner, a single bedroom with a lumpy mattress on a wooden frame. No electricity, just a few lanterns and candles. No running water, just a well out back. It was primitive, but that was part of the appeal. I unpacked my bag, set my flashlight on the table, and lit a lantern as the last bit of daylight faded outside. I spent the first evening sitting on the porch, listening to the sounds of the forest. Crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, the distant crack of a branch as some unseen animal moved through the trees. It was peaceful, but there was something unnerving about being so far from civilization. I was completely alone. If something happened, if someone showed up uninvited, there was no one to call for help. That thought lingered in the back of my mind as I locked the door and settled in for the night. The bed was stiff, the blankets musty, but I was tired from the drive. I fell asleep quickly. I woke up in the middle of the night to a sound outside. A crunch. Footsteps. I stayed still, listening. At first, I thought maybe it was an animal, a deer, or maybe a raccoon nosing around. But the steps were deliberate, slow, moving with purpose. I reached for my flashlight, clicked it on, and aimed it at the window. Nothing. Just the empty clearing and the tree line beyond. The sound stopped. I held my breath, waiting. The silence stretched on. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it had been a branch falling, or the natural settling of the cabin. After a few minutes, I shut off the flashlight and tried to go back to sleep. I barely slept. Every little creak and groan of the cabin had me on edge. When morning finally came, I felt exhausted, but I forced myself up and went outside to look around. There, just beyond the porch, I saw them, footprints. Large, deep, unmistakably human. I felt a cold wave of fear wash over me. Someone had been here, walking around my cabin in the middle of the night. I followed the tracks a few yards before they disappeared into the woods. Whoever it was had come from the trees, walked around my cabin, and then left the same way. I told myself it was probably a hiker, someone lost or curious. But deep down, I knew that didn't make sense. This place wasn't on any trail, and no one would be wandering out here in the middle of the night without a flashlight. I spent the rest of the day trying to shake the unease. I went down to the small creek about a mile away, gathered some water, tried to focus on the peace and quiet. But the feeling of being watched never left me. That night, I locked the door, wedged a chair under the handle, and kept my flashlight within reach. I didn't sleep. Sometime past midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps. This time they were closer. Slow, deliberate, then scraping. A sound right outside the door, like metal against wood. I sat up, heart pounding. The doorknob rattled. Someone was trying to get in. I grabbed my flashlight and clicked it on, shining it toward the window. Nothing, but the doorknob twisted again. Harder this time. I jumped out of bed, grabbed the heavy iron poker from the fireplace, and stepped toward the door. My breath was coming fast, my hands sweating as I gripped the metal. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Silence. I didn't move. I stood there waiting, listening. Minutes passed, then an hour. I stayed awake until the first light of dawn crept through the window. When I finally dared to open the door, my stomach dropped. The footprints were back, circling the cabin. But this time there was something else. A knife, stuck into the wooden door, right below the handle. I grabbed my bag, threw everything inside, and left. I didn't bother cleaning up, didn't take my time. I just got in my truck and drove, the tires kicking up dust as I sped down that narrow dirt road. I never told my friend exactly what happened, just said I wasn't cut out for the solitude. But I knew the truth. Someone had been out there, watching, waiting, and if I had stayed another night, I don't think I would have made it out. I got the cabin on a recommendation. A friend of a friend owned it. Some retired guy who rarely used it anymore. It sat deep in the Montana wilderness, miles from the nearest town, with no cell service and only a dirt road leading up to it. The whole point was to get away from everything. I'd been feeling burnt out for months, working nonstop, barely sleeping. I needed the silence, the isolation, the kind of quiet you could only find far away from people. It was a simple A-frame, nothing fancy. A single room with a lofted bed, a wood-burning stove, a small kitchen, and a narrow bathroom in the back. No electricity, just propane lights and a hand pump for water. The owner had left a stack of split firewood on the porch, along with a note. Asterisk, help yourself. Watch for bears. Asterisk. It was already late September, and the nights were cold. I spent the first day settling in, chopping extra firewood, making sure the stove worked. It felt good to work with my hands, to do something simple. By sundown, I was sitting in a rocking chair by the stove, drinking a beer, listening to the wind move through the trees. No traffic, no voices, no notifications pinging from my phone. Just the crackling of the fire and the occasional groan of the wind pressing against the walls. That first night, I slept deep, better than I had in years. But something woke me up just before dawn. A noise, a sharp, deliberate sound cutting through the wind. I lay still, heart pounding, listening. Came again, 3 heavy knocks on the porch. I sat up slowly, every sense on edge. The wind had died down, leaving a heavy stillness. I held my breath, waiting. Nothing. No footsteps, no retreating sounds, just silence stretching out for long, uncomfortable minutes. Eventually, I convinced myself it had been the wind knocking something over. Maybe a branch. I forced myself to lie back down, pulling the blanket up to my chin, waiting for sleep to take me again. Morning came clear and cold. The knocking from the night before felt distant, like something I dreamed. I stepped onto the porch with my coffee, looking around. The ground was damp from overnight dew. No footprints, no signs of anyone having been there. I spent the day hiking the woods around the cabin. The land stretched for miles. Tall pines, rolling hills, a river cutting through a rocky gorge about 3 miles east. It was the kind of place where you could disappear if you wanted to. The thought was both comforting and unsettling. That night, I triple-checked that the door was locked before climbing into bed. The stove burned low, filling the cabin with a steady warmth. I let myself relax, convincing myself that the night before had been nothing. I woke up to footsteps on the porch. This time I knew I wasn't imagining it. Heavy, deliberate steps, moving from one side of the porch to the other. Then silence. I stayed frozen in bed, heart hammering, listening so hard my ears hurt. The footsteps didn't come again, but I didn't sleep the rest of the night. At first light, I checked the porch again. Nothing. But this time, I noticed something. The stack of firewood had shifted. Some of the logs had been pulled off, scattered, like someone had been searching through them. I told myself it was an animal. A bear, maybe, though that didn't feel right. I spent the next few hours making noise, chopping more wood, slamming the axe into the stump over and over. A part of me wanted to scare off whatever had been creeping around. Another part just wanted to hear something other than the ringing silence. The third night, I barely slept. I sat up in the loft, flashlight in hand, listening. The wind came and went in slow gusts. The fire crackled. Every sound felt magnified, stretched thin. I must have dozed off at some point because I woke with a start to something inside the cabin. A soft creak, the kind wood makes when weight shifts against it. My body locked up. I strained my ears, barely breathing. Another creak. It was coming from the corner of the room, near the kitchen. The darkness was thick, swallowing everything beyond the reach of my flashlight. I gripped the handle of my knife, flicked on the light, and shone it toward the sound. Nothing. The cabin was empty. I stayed awake until dawn, jumping at every gust of wind, every settling groan of the cabin's old beams. When daylight finally came, I stepped outside and saw the footprints. They weren't mine. They led from the treeline to the cabin and then back again. Large, heavy boot prints. Someone had been watching. Someone had been inside. I packed my bag in under 5 minutes, shoving clothes and gear into my pack with shaking hands. I didn't care about leaving food behind. I didn't care about anything except getting the hell away. The dirt road leading out of the forest felt longer than I remembered. The trees pressed in from both sides, making me feel exposed, like eyes were following me from the shadows. I didn't stop, didn't breathe easy until I hit the highway. Later, when I told the cabin's owner about it, he just sighed. Said something like, "Yeah, I stopped going up there for a reason." I didn't ask him what that reason was. I didn't want to know. The plan was simple. A weekend alone in a remote cabin, tucked deep into the woods, far from cell service, traffic noise, and the distractions of everyday life. I'd rented it off a listing site, the pictures showing a sturdy, one-room structure with a wood stove, a cot, and a small kitchen area. It sat in a clearing, surrounded by thick pine trees, with a narrow dirt trail leading up to it. The listing mentioned that the nearest maintained road was nearly 4 miles away. It was exactly what I wanted. A place where no one would bother me, and I could just exist in silence for a few days. The drive out took longer than expected. The road turned from pavement to gravel, then from gravel to dirt, and then finally into something barely passable. My truck bounced and shuddered as I navigated ruts and dips. It was late afternoon when I finally arrived, the sun hanging low behind the trees, casting long shadows across the clearing. The cabin was exactly as described, small but solid, with a single window looking out toward the trees. I wasted no time unpacking. I had a cooler full of food, a sleeping bag, a flashlight, and a book. I also had my rifle, something I always brought when venturing into the deep woods alone. I set everything inside, checked the wood stove, and then stepped back out to look around. The air was crisp and still, with only the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a bird breaking the silence. There was no sign of anyone else for miles. Just me, the cabin, and the trees. That first night, everything was peaceful. I cooked a simple meal on the propane burner, read for a bit by flashlight, then rolled out my sleeping bag on the cot. The silence pressed in, but it was the kind I liked, the kind that made the world feel larger, not smaller. I fell asleep quickly, listening to the wind moving through the trees outside. I woke up in the middle of the night to a noise. At first, I wasn't sure what had pulled me from sleep. The cabin was pitch black, my breath warm inside my sleeping bag. I held still, listening, straining to hear past the blood pounding in my ears. There was nothing at first, just the wind outside, the creak of the wooden walls settling. Then I heard it again, a distinct, deliberate sound. Something was moving outside. Not the wind, not the normal sounds of the forest. It was heavier, more intentional. A step, then another. I sat up slowly, heart thudding. I reached for my flashlight, flicked it on, and swept the beam toward the door. The latch was still in place. I shifted the light toward the window, but all I could see was darkness beyond the glass. I waited, barely breathing. Minutes passed. The sound didn't come again. Eventually, I convinced myself it had been my imagination. Or maybe a deer wandering close to the cabin, curious about the scent of my food. I lay back down, telling myself there was no reason to be nervous. The next morning, I stepped outside to check around the cabin. The ground was still damp from an earlier rain, and it didn't take long to find tracks. Not deer tracks, boot prints. The realization sent a chill up my spine. They were fresh, too fresh. The tread was deep, pressed into the damp earth, leading from the tree line straight up to the side of the cabin. Then they turned and walked back into the woods. I stood there for a long time, staring at them. I was miles from anyone. No one was supposed to be out here. I spent the rest of the day uneasy. I tried to brush it off. Maybe some hiker had wandered too far and passed by my cabin. Maybe someone had been lost. But why had they come so close? In the middle of the night. Why hadn't they made themselves known? I kept my rifle close that day, constantly listening. The forest felt different now, like it was watching me. That night, I locked the door and barred it with a chair. I kept my flashlight and rifle within arm's reach. I barely slept. Somewhere in the early morning hours, I heard it again. This time, there was no mistaking it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, right outside the cabin. I sat up, gripping the rifle tight, my hands slick with sweat. My flashlight beam cut across the wooden walls. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The footsteps circled. Whoever was out there, they weren't lost. They weren't a hiker who had wandered too far. They were watching, and they knew I was inside. I waited, my heart hammering so loud it felt like it would give me away. The footsteps faded after what felt like forever, retreating into the trees. I didn't move until dawn. When the sun rose, I gathered my things. The trip was over. I wasn't staying another night. As I loaded my gear into my truck, I checked the ground. More boot prints. They had circled the cabin multiple times. I followed them to the tree line, but they disappeared into the undergrowth. I drove out fast, not stopping, not looking back. When I finally reached cell service, I called the owner of the cabin, told them what had happened. They were quiet for a long moment before they spoke. "You're not the first one to say something like that." I didn't ask what they meant. I just kept driving, putting as much distance between myself and that cabin as I could. I never went back, and I never will. I never thought a simple weekend in a remote cabin would leave me questioning every decision I had made to get there. I had always loved the idea of solitude, of escaping from the noise of everyday life. But there is something about being alone in the wilderness that can shift from peaceful to terrifying in an instant. The cabin was deep in the woods, miles from the nearest paved road. The drive had been rough, my tires kicking up dust and gravel as I navigated winding back roads. By the time I arrived, the sun was already dipping low behind the trees, casting long shadows across the clearing where the cabin stood. It was a simple structure, one room, a small porch, a stone chimney, and a pile of split firewood stacked neatly against the side. It looked old but sturdy, the kind of place built by someone who knew how to live off the land. I parked my car near the tree line, grabbed my backpack, and stepped onto the porch. The front door creaked when I pushed it open, revealing the inside exactly as I had imagined. Wooden walls darkened with age, a cast iron stove in the corner, a small cot with a thin mattress, and a single window looking out into the forest. A lantern sat on the shelf beside a few cans of food, and a rusty axe leaned against the doorframe. There was no electricity, no running water, just isolation. I unpacked my things, set up my sleeping bag on the cot, and built a small fire in the stove. The crackling flames filled the cabin with warmth, and for the first hour or so, it was peaceful. I listened to the distant sounds of the woods, branches swaying, leaves rustling, the occasional snap of a twig. But as the night deepened, those sounds began to change. At first, it was subtle, a faint noise just outside the cabin, like something brushing against the walls. I dismissed it as the wind or a stray branch falling from a tree. But then, it happened again. A deliberate sound, a slow, dragging noise along the side of the cabin. I sat up in my cot, my heartbeat steady but alert. I wasn't the type to panic easily, but I also wasn't stupid. I reached for the lantern, turning up the wick to cast more light. The room glowed, the shadows shifting, but nothing seemed out of place. Then came the knock. Not a polite knock, not a random creak from the wood settling. A single, heavy knock. My first thought was that someone had followed me here. Maybe another hunter, a lost hiker, or even someone looking for trouble. My mind raced through the possibilities, but no matter how I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't ignore the unease creeping up my spine. I stood slowly, moving toward the window. The glass was old and smudged, making it difficult to see clearly, but I could make out the shape of the forest, still and dark. I held my breath, listening. Nothing. Then, another knock, this time louder, more forceful. I grabbed the axe from beside the door, gripping the handle tightly. I wasn't about to open the door without knowing who or what was outside. Instead, I called out. My voice sounded strange in the silence, like it didn't belong in that space. No answer, just the quiet hum of the woods. Minutes passed, and the knocking didn't come again. Maybe it had been an animal, a bear, a deer, something curious about the light in the cabin. That's what I told myself as I forced my body to relax. I placed the axe within arm's reach and lay back down on the cot, staring at the ceiling until my eyes grew heavy. Sometime in the night, I woke up, not because of a noise, but because of the absence of one. The forest was silent. No wind, no insects, no distant owl calls, just a suffocating stillness. Then I heard it, breathing. It was faint, but unmistakable. Slow, steady breaths just outside the cabin wall. I didn't move. I barely allowed myself to exhale. Every nerve in my body was telling me to stay still, to listen. The breathing continued, shifting slightly as if whoever or whatever it was moving along the wall. Then came the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate. They circled the cabin once. Then again. Then a third time. By the fourth pass, I had the axe gripped so tightly my knuckles ached. My heartbeat pounded against my ribs, and I could feel sweat forming on my back despite the cool night air. Then, without warning, the footsteps stopped. For what felt like an eternity, I sat frozen, waiting. And then the door handle turned. A slow, testing twist. Not a forceful entry, but as if someone wanted to see if I had left it unlocked. I gripped the axe tighter, ready to swing if the door opened. But it didn't. The handle stopped moving. Then came one final knock, so loud it rattled the wood. Then silence. I stayed awake until the first light of dawn seeped through the window. When I finally worked up the courage to open the door, I half expected to find footprints in the dirt. But there was nothing. No signs of anyone or anything being there. I packed up my things and left that morning. I didn't look back. I didn't try to rationalize what had happened. I just drove, leaving the cabin behind, knowing I would never return. Some places aren't meant to be visited alone. And some things, no matter how much you try to explain them away, will never make sense. All I know is that I left that cabin with more questions than I had when I arrived. And I don't think I'll ever find the answers. I took the cabin rental as a chance to get away from everything. No people, no noise, just me and the woods. It was late October, the air crisp but not unbearable. The cabin sat deep in the mountains, at least a dozen miles from the nearest paved road. I'd found it through an old listing online, a private rental, no formal company behind it. Just some guy named Henry who told me to leave the cash in an envelope on the kitchen counter when I arrived. The drive out had been rough. The dirt road wound through dense forest, the kind that turned pitch black at night. My truck's tires struggled against the ruts and loose gravel, the suspension groaning with each deep dip. It took me nearly an hour of careful maneuvering before I reached the clearing where the cabin sat. It was nothing fancy, just a single-story log structure with a small porch, a fire pit out front, and a creek running about 50 yards away. The first thing I noticed when I stepped out of the truck was the quiet. Not peaceful, but thick, heavy. No birdsong, no wind rustling through the trees. Just stillness. I shook it off. It was late in the season. Maybe the wildlife had already started hunkering down for winter. I grabbed my bags and made my way inside. The interior was basic but comfortable. A wood-burning stove, a sagging couch, a tiny kitchenette, and a bedroom in the back. No electricity, just gas lanterns and a backup generator outside. No cell signal either. The only way to communicate with the outside world was a landline phone mounted on the wall, the kind with a coiled cord and yellowing plastic. Henry had told me it worked most of the time, but not to count on it. I set my bags down and started unpacking. Clothes in the dresser, food in the cabinets. I stacked the firewood inside near the stove and got a fire going before darkness set in. The warmth filled the space quickly, the flickering light casting long shadows across the walls. By the time I finished, the sun had dipped below the trees and the temperature had dropped. I locked the door out of habit, though I doubted there was anyone else out here. The nearest property was miles away. The only real concern was wildlife, maybe a black bear sniffing around for food, but I'd stored everything properly. I made a simple dinner, canned chili heated over the stove, washed down with a beer. I sat by the window, looking out into the darkness. The woods pressed in close, barely visible in the dim moonlight. Then I heard it, a rustling outside. Not an animal scurrying through the underbrush, something heavier, moving with purpose. I tensed, listening. Came from the trees just beyond the clearing. A steady, deliberate crunch of leaves. Then it stopped. I stood slowly, my heart pounding. I grabbed the flashlight from the counter, clicked it on, and aimed it through the window. The beam cut through the darkness, sweeping over the clearing. Nothing. I exhaled, shaking my head. Probably a deer. The woods played tricks on your ears when you were alone. Sounds seemed closer, larger than they really were. I turned back to the table and heard it again. This time it was closer, just outside the cabin. A soft shuffle against the porch. The breath caught in my throat. I moved slowly to the door, gripping the flashlight tight. Through the peephole, I saw nothing but empty porch. Then a single, deliberate knock. I froze. The sound was too measured, too precise for an animal. No one should be out here. No one knew I was here except Henry, and I doubted he'd show up unannounced. Another knock, slightly harder this time. I didn't answer. I stepped back, my mind racing. If this was someone lost or hurt, they would have called out by now. But they didn't. Just those slow, deliberate knocks. Then silence. I waited, my ears straining. Nothing. I stayed awake for hours, listening. The fire burned low, casting flickering shadows across the walls. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I dozed off on the couch, fitful and uneasy. I woke up to pale morning light seeping through the windows. Everything looked normal, except for the footprints on the porch. They weren't animal tracks. They were boot prints, large and deep-set in the frost. Someone had stood there for a long time, watching. I scanned the area, but there were no other prints leading away, just the ones on the porch. I locked the cabin up tight and spent the day keeping busy, hiking a little, chopping wood. By evening, I told myself I'd imagined it, that I'd let my nerves get the best of me. Then night fell, and the knocking started again. A slow, steady tap. I stayed still, barely breathing. Then the doorknob rattled. A cold sweat broke out on my skin. I grabbed the rifle from where I'd propped it against the wall, my hands shaking. Whoever was out there wasn't just passing through. They were testing the door. The handle stopped moving. Then the footsteps started. Heavy, deliberate steps circling the cabin. I moved to the window, raising the flashlight, but all I saw was darkness. The footsteps stopped directly beneath the bedroom window. Then a deep exhale. I clenched my jaw, gripping the rifle so tight my knuckles turned white. Minutes passed, then an hour, then nothing. I didn't sleep that night. At dawn, I packed my things and left. I didn't even bother with breakfast, just shoved everything into my truck and tore down that dirt road faster than was safe. When I finally got service, I called Henry. I told him someone had been at the cabin, that I'd heard knocking, footsteps, that I wasn't staying another night. He was quiet for a long time. Then he sighed and said, "Yeah, you're not the first." I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't want to know. I never went back. I had been looking forward to the trip for months. A full week in a remote cabin, deep in the woods, far from the noise of the city. The idea of being alone, surrounded by nothing but nature, was exactly what I needed. No phone service, no distractions. Just the quiet hum of the forest, the crackling of a fire, and the occasional sound of animals moving through the underbrush. I had rented the cabin online, a simple one-room structure with a wood stove, a cot, and just enough supplies to get by. The drive up was uneventful. The roads gradually narrowed from paved highways to cracked asphalt, then to dirt and gravel. The last few miles were barely a road at all, just 2 tire tracks winding through dense pines. By the time I reached the clearing where the cabin sat, the sun was already low in the sky. The place looked even smaller in person, a squat wooden structure with a slanted roof, weathered logs, and a small porch. I parked the truck and took a moment to listen. The silence was almost unnerving. No traffic, no voices, just the occasional rustle of leaves. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. I grabbed my bags, hauled them inside, and set about making the place livable. Inside, it was basic but comfortable. A cot against the back wall, a wood stove near the center, and a single table with a chair. Shelves lined one wall, stocked with old canned goods, a few pots, and a pile of neatly stacked firewood. There was a narrow door leading to a tiny bathroom, just a composting toilet and a bucket for washing. I unpacked, made a fire, and sat on the porch with a beer, watching the last of the daylight fade. The trees stretched in every direction, thick and endless. As darkness settled, I felt the first twinge of unease. There was something different about being alone out here. In the city, I was used to the distant hum of life, traffic, sirens, voices. Here, the quiet was absolute, pressed in from all sides. That first night, I slept lightly. Every creak of the cabin, every whisper of wind through the trees made me stir. Around midnight, I woke to a sound outside, a rhythmic crunching, like footsteps in the snow, except there was no snow. I held my breath, listening. The steps moved past the cabin, fading into the woods. I told myself it was an animal and forced myself to sleep. The next morning, I walked around the cabin, looking for tracks. The ground was damp, but I saw nothing unusual. No footprints, no disturbed leaves. Maybe I had imagined it. I spent the day hiking, fishing at a nearby stream, and gathering firewood. By evening, I felt more at ease. I cooked over the fire, read by lantern light, and let the quiet settle around me. That night, I woke again. This time, the sound was closer. A slow, deliberate movement just outside the cabin walls. Something brushing against the wood, scraping lightly. My pulse pounded in my ears. I sat up, barely breathing, straining to hear. The sound stopped. Silence stretched on. I stayed awake until dawn, gripping my flashlight. When morning came, I checked outside again. Nothing. No prints, no marks on the cabin. I told myself it was paranoia, the way the mind plays tricks in the dark. The third night, it got worse. I had just dozed off when I woke to a loud thump against the side of the cabin. Not a small sound. It was solid, forceful. I grabbed my flashlight and knife, heart hammering. The air outside was deathly still. I pressed my ear against the wall, listening. Nothing, but I knew something had been out there. By now, I was uneasy. I spent the next day scouting the area, looking for anything out of place. About 50 yards from the cabin, I found something that made my stomach drop. A tree with deep, deliberate gouges in the bark. Not claw marks, cuts, like someone had taken a knife and carved into it. The marks were fresh. I turned back toward the cabin, suddenly aware of how exposed I was. The walk back felt longer. Every snap of a twig made my skin crawl. I started to feel watched, like something was just beyond my vision, keeping pace with me. That night, I barricaded the door with the heavy table and kept my flashlight within reach. I forced myself to stay awake, listening. Around midnight, the sounds started again. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. This time, they circled the cabin. I gripped my knife and flashlight, my pulse a rapid drumbeat. The footsteps stopped at the front door. Silence. Then a soft, deliberate scrape against the wood. I wanted to scream, to burst out of the cabin and run, but I forced myself to stay put. Minutes passed. Then, slowly, the footsteps retreated. I stayed frozen, gripping my knife, listening as they faded into the woods. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. First light, I packed. I didn't care about leaving early. I didn't care about the money I had spent. I just wanted to be gone. As I loaded the truck, I looked back at the cabin. That's when I saw it. On the porch railing, carved deep into the wood, was a single word: leave. The letters were jagged, fresh. My breath caught. I didn't hesitate. I jumped into the truck and tore down that narrow road, not stopping until I hit pavement. I never found out who or what had been out there, but I never went back, and I never will. I don't know why I thought renting a remote cabin for a week alone was a good idea. Maybe I just wanted space. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself that I could do it. Be totally alone, away from people, distractions, and the noise of everyday life. I'd spent years hiking and camping, even solo, so it wasn't like I was new to being in the wilderness. But something about staying in a fixed place, alone, in a structure rather than a tent, felt different. The cabin sat deep in the mountains, a good 20 miles from the nearest town, down a long gravel road that turned into a narrow dirt path winding through dense pines. I'd found it on a rental site, advertised as an off-the-grid experience. It had no electricity, just a wood stove for heat and propane lanterns for light. There was a well pump out back and an outhouse down a short trail. The pictures made it look cozy, thick log walls, a stone fireplace, and a front porch overlooking a small clearing. Sounded perfect. I arrived in the late afternoon, my truck kicking up dust as I pulled into the clearing. The cabin looked just like the photos, though the wood was darker and more worn than I expected. It had clearly been there for decades. The front door was locked with a heavy iron latch, but the key from the rental company worked fine. Inside, the air was stale, carrying the scent of old wood and ash. The furniture was simple: a wooden table with 2 chairs, a small cot with a lumpy mattress, and a few shelves lined with old tin cans and mismatched dishes. A heavy axe leaned against the stone fireplace, its handle smooth from years of use. I went about settling in, unloading my gear and stacking firewood inside. There was plenty of wood already chopped in a covered pile out back, which was a relief. I didn't plan on using the wood stove much, but the nights would be cold, and I didn't want to risk running out. As the sun dipped behind the trees, the temperature dropped fast. I lit a propane lantern, casting a warm glow against the cabin walls, and cooked a simple meal on my camp stove. The first night passed quietly. I heard the usual sounds of the woods: branches creaking, distant rustling in the underbrush, the occasional hoot of an owl. Nothing out of the ordinary, but by the second night, things started to feel off. It was small things at first. The feeling that the forest around the cabin was too quiet. The way the shadows seemed darker than they should be when I stepped outside with my headlamp. I chalked it up to nerves. I wasn't used to staying in one spot for long periods. I was more accustomed to moving through the wilderness, not staying still in it. Then I noticed the footprints. I was gathering firewood that evening when I saw them, just past the clearing where the trees thickened. Large boot prints, half sunken in the damp earth. My first thought was that they were mine. I'd been walking around earlier, after all. But when I compared them to my own, I realized these were bigger, wider, and they were fresh. I stared at them for a long moment, trying to rationalize it. Maybe a hunter had passed through earlier in the day. Maybe the owner of the cabin had come to check on the place recently. But something about them unsettled me. They led from the tree line to the side of the cabin, then stopped. No return trail. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the cabin made my skin prickle. I kept my knife close, my headlamp within reach. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I'd see more prints in the morning, a sign that it was just an animal or a lost hiker. But when I checked at first light, there was nothing new. Just the same set of prints leading to the cabin and stopping dead. On the third day, I decided to explore the area more. Maybe I'd find some sign of other people, a fire pit, a hunting blind, something to explain the prints. I followed a narrow game trail deeper into the woods, keeping my bearings as I walked. The forest was dense, and the farther I went, the quieter it seemed. I had that strange sensation again, like I was being watched, though I couldn't see anything unusual. Then I found the cabin. Not the one I was staying in, another one smaller and much older. It was hidden in the trees, its roof sagging, its walls covered in moss. The door hung slightly open. I hesitated at first, then stepped closer. It smelled of rot, the damp wood giving way to time and neglect. Inside, there were no signs of recent use, just broken furniture, an old iron stove rusted through, and the remnants of an old bed frame. But on the floor, in the dust, were footprints. Not mine, not old ones either, fresh. I backed out quickly, heart pounding. Someone had been here, maybe recently, maybe still was. I hurried back to my cabin, every snap of a twig making my pulse jump. I locked the door behind me, double-checking the latch, though I knew it wouldn't stop anyone determined to get in. I spent the rest of the day inside, my knife at arm's reach, listening. The woods outside felt wrong, the silence heavy, like the forest itself was waiting for something. Night fell, and I forced myself to stay calm. I built a fire in the stove, hoping the warmth would make me feel less vulnerable. Then, just past midnight, I heard it. A slow, deliberate sound outside. Footsteps. Not an animal. Person. The footsteps moved around the cabin, slow and unhurried, circling. I held my breath, gripping my knife so tight my knuckles ached. Then silence. Minutes passed. Then an hour. I stayed awake until dawn, every muscle in my body tense. When the first light crept through the cracks in the walls, I forced myself to step outside. The ground was damp with morning dew, and there, pressed into the mud, were footprints, leading from the tree line, circling the cabin, then stopping by the front door. I didn't hesitate. I packed my things in record time, shoving everything into my backpack, barely pausing to check if I had it all. I got into my truck and drove, not looking back, not stopping until I reached the main road. I never found out who was out there. Maybe it was just some hunter, maybe a squatter, maybe something worse. But I never rented another cabin alone again. The plan had been simple. A week alone at a rented cabin deep in the Montana wilderness. A break from everything. No phone, no internet, just me, the woods, and the quiet. I had booked the place through a backcountry rental site, drawn in by the promise of total solitude. The listing had been bare bones, off-grid, wood stove for heat, solar-powered lights, and a well for water. That was all I needed. The drive out had been uneventful, long stretches of empty road cutting through rolling hills and thick pine forest. The last 20 miles had been on a dirt road, winding higher into the mountains. My truck was the only vehicle I had seen for nearly an hour. No cell service, but I had expected that. I had paper maps and a compass just in case. The cabin sat in a small clearing, weathered but sturdy, with a covered porch and a stack of firewood beside the door. A single-room layout, bed in one corner, wood stove in another, a tiny kitchenette against the wall. There was a separate outhouse about 30 yards behind the cabin. Basic, but enough. The first couple of days were peaceful. I spent my time hiking the nearby trails, gathering firewood, and reading. The silence was something I had forgotten existed, broken only by the rustling of trees and the occasional distant cry of an animal. Nights were colder than I had expected, but the wood stove kept the cabin warm. I had brought a rifle with me, mostly for peace of mind, though I kept it loaded by the bed. The first odd thing happened on the third night. I woke up to the sound of something moving outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind pushing against the trees, but then I heard footsteps. Heavy, deliberate. I sat up in bed, every muscle tense. The steps circled the cabin once, then stopped near the front door. I held my breath, waiting for something more, but after several minutes, I heard the steps retreat into the woods. In the morning, I checked around the cabin. No footprints, just the soft layer of pine needles covering the ground. Could have been an animal, I reasoned. A bear, maybe. I let it go. The next night, it happened again. This time, I heard the steps coming from the direction of the outhouse. Slow, deliberate crunching on the forest floor. I grabbed my rifle and slid out of bed, careful to avoid making noise. I stood by the door, listening. The steps circled the cabin again, stopping for long pauses. My heart was hammering against my ribs. Then I heard something different, a scraping sound, like nails or claws dragging across the wooden walls. My stomach turned. I had locked the door before bed, but that sound made me check again, pressing my weight against the solid wood. It held firm. The sound moved along the wall, then faded into the trees. I barely slept after that. The next morning, I scouted the perimeter again. This time I found something, a single boot print near the outhouse. Large, bigger than my own. I stared at it, trying to make sense of it. The nearest town was miles away. Who would be out here barefoot or in one boot? That day, I hiked further than usual, circling back toward the cabin in the late afternoon. I wanted to get a better sense of the land, to see if there were any signs of recent human activity. I found nothing. No other footprints, no trash, no paths that looked recently disturbed. The unease sat heavy in my chest. That night, I locked the door, loaded the rifle, and kept a fire going in the stove. I sat up, listening. The wind had picked up, rattling the trees outside. Hours passed. Then footsteps again, closer this time. Then the doorknob rattled. I nearly dropped the rifle in my hands. Someone was outside. The rattling stopped, but I could hear breathing just beyond the door. Slow, measured. I felt like a deer caught in headlights. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. Then a whisper, too faint to make out the words. I gripped the rifle tighter, heart pounding in my ears. Then silence. I don't know how long I sat there, barely breathing. When I finally forced myself to move, my legs were stiff, my hands sore from gripping the gun too hard. I didn't sleep at all. At dawn, I stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand. There were new boot prints circling the cabin. They led toward the trees, then vanished into the underbrush. I made my decision then. I packed up my gear, loaded the truck, and got out of there. The whole drive back down that dirt road, I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see someone standing in the trees, watching. When I finally reached cell service, I called the rental company. I told them someone had been trespassing around the cabin at night. They acted surprised, but something in the way the person on the phone hesitated made my skin crawl. I never got an answer to what had been out there with me. No explanation, no closure. I don't go into the woods alone anymore. The cabin was nothing special. Just a simple single-story structure with a tin roof and a stone chimney, tucked deep into the woods. It had been built decades ago, probably by some hunter or recluse who wanted to be away from everything. That was exactly what I needed. A place far from town, far from people, far from distractions. Just me, the quiet, and time to clear my head. The drive-in had been rough. A long, rutted dirt road twisted through the trees, the kind of road where you couldn't go more than 10 miles an hour without rattling the bolts loose on your truck. The trees pressed in close, their bare branches clawing at the sky. It was late October, and the forest had already surrendered to the cold. The leaves had turned brittle and fallen away, leaving nothing but skeletal limbs swaying in the wind. The cabin itself sat in a small clearing, just a few hundred yards from a sluggish creek. There was no electricity, no plumbing, no cell service. Just an old wood stove for heat, a hand pump for water, and a rickety outhouse about 20 yards into the trees. Inside, there was a cot, a small table, some mismatched chairs, and a set of shelves lined with dusty old cans of beans and soup, probably left behind by the last person to use the place. I unloaded my gear: a sleeping bag, a lantern, some food, and a rifle, not because I expected trouble, but because it was stupid to be in the woods without one. The nearest town was over an hour away. If anything went wrong, I'd be on my own. The first night passed uneventfully. I ate a can of chili, listened to the wind scrape against the walls, and let the silence settle into me. The woods were always quiet this time of year. Most of the birds had gone south. The insects were dead or dormant. Now and then, a gust of wind would shake the trees or send a dry leaf skittering across the ground. Other than that, nothing. By the second night, I started noticing little things. The first was the smell. Faint at first, barely noticeable. A sour, rotting odor that clung to the air when the wind died down. I figured it was just something dead out in the woods. Maybe a deer that hadn't made it through the last hunting season. It didn't seem close, so I ignored it. The second was the sound. Around midnight, as I was lying in my sleeping bag, I heard something move outside. It wasn't the wind. The wind made the trees groan and creak, sent leaves skittering along the ground. This was different, something deliberate, something heavy. A crunch of dead leaves. Then another. Then silence. I sat up, listening. Nothing. I grabbed the rifle, just in case, and moved to the door. Pressed my ear against the rough wood. Nothing but the wind. After a while, I went back to bed. Probably just a deer passing through. Maybe a raccoon. Whatever it was gone now. The third night was when I started to feel uneasy. I was chopping wood when I noticed the first set of tracks. They weren't mine. They weren't from any animal I recognized either. Human, but wrong. The spacing was off, like whoever made them had been limping. The footprints wandered in a loose circle around the clearing, disappearing into the trees. I followed them a few yards before losing them in the undergrowth. My first thought was that maybe some hunter had gotten lost, but that didn't explain why they'd been circling my cabin. That night, I locked the door and wedged a chair under the handle. The windows didn't have locks, but I shoved the table against one and stacked some firewood in front of the other, just in case. The noise came again sometime after midnight, louder this time, closer. A slow, deliberate crunch of footsteps in the leaves. Then a pause. Then another step. I held my breath. My fingers tightened around the rifle. Something scraped against the outside wall. A soft, dragging sound, like fingers or claws, raking against the wood. My mouth went dry. I forced myself to stay still, to listen. A long silence. Then footsteps again, moving away this time, fading into the trees. I didn't sleep after that. By morning, the tracks were back. More of them this time, circling the cabin in erratic, looping patterns. Some came right up to the door. I had the sudden, sickening realization that whoever, whatever, was out there had been watching me. I packed my things, fast, threw my sleeping bag into the truck, grabbed my rifle, slammed the door shut. The whole time, I kept glancing at the trees, half expecting something to come lurching out of the woods. Nothing did. The drive out felt longer than the drive in. The whole time, I kept checking the rearview mirror, scanning the woods, looking for movement. I didn't see anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I never went back to that cabin. A few weeks later, curiosity got the better of me. I looked up the area, searched for any reports of missing hunters, hikers, anything. I didn't find much, just an old news clipping from years ago. Something about a hermit who'd lived out there, gone missing without a trace. Maybe it was just an animal. Maybe I let my imagination get the best of me. Or maybe something was still out there, circling that cabin, waiting for the next person to come along. I had been searching for a place to get away for a while. Somewhere quiet, away from the noise of the city. I wanted something secluded, something that felt untouched. When I found an old listing online for a cabin deep in the woods of northern Montana, It seemed perfect. It was small, nothing fancy, just a single-story wooden cabin with a loft for sleeping, a wood stove, and a wraparound porch. No electricity, no running water. That was part of the appeal. The listing described it as a rustic retreat for solitude seekers. The photos showed a sturdy structure surrounded by towering pines, a small creek running just a few yards away, and a narrow dirt road leading to it. It was exactly what I was looking for. I arrived just before sunset. The drive had been long, taking me hours away from the nearest town, down winding roads that grew narrower the deeper I went. The last stretch was barely a road at all, just tire tracks worn into the dirt. My truck struggled in places where the ground had softened from recent rain, but I managed to get through. The moment I stepped out, I felt it. The kind of silence you only find deep in the wilderness. No cars, no distant hum of power lines. Just the occasional rustling of wind through the trees and the soft trickle of water from the creek. Felt good, peaceful. The cabin itself looked sturdy enough, though it had clearly been sitting and used for a while. The wood was weathered, and a few shingles were missing from the roof, but it was intact. The windows were covered with old, thick curtains, and the porch sagged slightly under my weight as I walked up the steps. A single wooden chair sat in the corner, covered in dust and cobwebs. Inside, the air was stale but not unpleasant. The cabin was simple. One large room with a wood stove in the corner, a small table with 2 chairs, and a narrow ladder leading up to the sleeping loft. The walls were lined with open shelves, most of them empty except for a few dusty mason jars and an old oil lamp. A small axe leaned against the wall near a pile of firewood. I set down my bags and got to work making the place livable. I opened the windows to let in fresh air, shook out the musty blankets from the loft, and started a fire in the stove. By the time the sun had fully set, I had everything in order. I made a simple dinner of canned beans and bread, washed it down with a bottle of water, then sat on the porch listening to the sounds of the forest. It was perfect. I don't know when I fell asleep, but I woke up suddenly, the kind of jolt that happens when your body senses something before your mind fully registers it. The fire in the stove had burned low, casting flickering shadows along the walls. Then I heard it, a sound outside, not an animal, not the wind. It was slow, deliberate, the sound of something moving through the trees, just beyond the edge of the clearing. I held my breath and listened. The steps were uneven. Something or someone was walking through the underbrush, not crashing through it like a deer or a bear would, but careful, like they were trying to stay quiet. I reached for the axe. The footsteps stopped. I waited, gripping the handle so tightly my fingers ached. Then, after what felt like forever, the sound started again, moving away this time, fading into the distance until they disappeared completely. I sat there for a long time, barely breathing. Eventually, exhaustion won out over fear. I climbed into the loft, keeping the axe within arm's reach, and forced myself to sleep. The next morning, I searched the perimeter of the cabin. The ground was damp from the previous rain, and sure enough, there were footprints in the mud. Human footprints, large, deep. They came from the trees, circled the cabin, then led back into the woods. I spent the day trying to convince myself that it was nothing. Maybe a hunter passing through, maybe someone lost. But there was no reason for anyone to be out here. The cabin had been abandoned for years, and I hadn't seen another soul for miles. That night, I kept the fire burning and stayed awake as long as I could. Hours passed with nothing, just the crackling of the fire and the occasional hoot of an owl. Then, just past midnight, something moved outside. This time it was closer, a slow, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the ground. I gripped the axe and stood by the door, heart pounding. The sound circled the cabin, stopping just outside the window. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then, a single knock, not loud, just a soft, deliberate tap against the wood. I stayed frozen, every muscle locked. Another knock, then silence. I didn't sleep that night. At first light, I packed my things and left. I didn't bother cleaning up, didn't take time to eat. I threw everything into my truck and tore down that dirt road as fast as it would take me. I never looked back. When I reached the nearest town, I stopped at a diner, still running on pure adrenaline. The waitress must have seen the look on my face because she asked if I was all right. I thought about telling her, about the footsteps, the knocking, the tracks outside the cabin. But what would I even say? That I had been scared? That someone or something had watched me in the dark? Instead, I just ordered coffee. I never went back to that cabin. Never checked the listing again. Somewhere out there, in those woods, someone knew I had been there. And they had been watching.